everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is Matt Taglia, Senior Director of Emerson College Polling. Matt, thanks so much for coming back on.
Thanks for having me, Brittany.
Emerson College Polling just released a new wide-ranging poll, and I would love to dive right in. So let's start with President Trump's approval rating. As we sit here right now, he's almost completed a full 9 months of his second term. Where does his approval rating stand now?
Yeah, Brittany, and I think, the story here is we have seen President Trump's approval rating sort of consistently but slowly drop over the course of his second term as president. Right now, it stands at 45% approve, 48% disapprove. This is not a terrible place to be. Again, a -3 rating here, that's really not that bad, especially considering how Trump's approval rating was when he left office after his first term. This is still a major improvement since then. It's a major improvement upon several other presidents who have had poor approval ratings overall. When we look at the issues, though, we start to see where some of that foundation starts to break, and we start to see why some folks really do disapprove of President Trump.
Let's talk about where you're seeing that foundation crack. Let's talk about any potential demo shifts, because that is a worrying trend, consistent but slowly moving downward in the trajectory of the approval rating. I know, as you said, it's only -3, but no one wants to see a downward trajectory. Who's changing their minds on President Trump?
Yeah, and I don't know that it's necessarily that folks are changing their minds, but top of mind for really everyone is the economy. And we see that Trump overall has a negative approval rating on the economy, 37% approve versus 52%, a majority disapprove. Now, when we look at those demographics, we see that this is largely driven by younger folks. So folks who are under the age of 50, these are the ones who are feeling this economic number the most. They say it's their most important issue, and we can see why they, in particular, are really losing faith in President Trump. They're not seeing the results that they want in the economy. And I think that that's taking a toll on his overall top line approval number.
This has been like we have been on repeat for the past over a year, that it all comes down to the economy. The economy continues to be the top issue facing voters. And that's a large reason why President Trump won back in 2024. I know you're saying young people aren't feeling really optimistic about the economy, but what about other demos? Are they feeling like their personal financial situation now is better than it was a year ago?
Well, we haven't seen too much change in this number. So 40% say that their personal finances, their household finances, are worse than it was about a year ago. About 30% say that their finances are better, and 30% say that they're about the same. Once again, we're seeing these younger folks say that they are worse off. A majority say that they are worse off now than they were a year ago. So, I think we really sort of have to look at this through the lens of age here. Trump is maintaining some approval with his older cohort. Obviously, Republicans, independents overall disapprove of his job performance. And they are likewise feeling that pinch of the economy and their personal finances. But when we look at it through the lens of personal finances, the economy, housing affordability, we really see that younger group under the age of 50, they're the ones feeling it most, and they're the ones who are now disapproving of Trump.
And really within the past year, like I just said, we've seen the economy be the top issue, followed by a slew of other ones. Are we seeing much movement when it comes to the other issues that Americans are concerned about, or are they pretty much the same?
So they are pretty close. I think if you compare it to, the past year or so, things have changed a little bit. We see that the economy still at 31%, that is the top issue, and will probably remain so for quite some time. Threats to democracy, however, is where we really see a shift. 23% say that threats to democracy is their top issue. We saw that first in the run-up to the 2024 election, and it really hasn't dropped much since then. So, this past year, it's been pretty similar, but that threats number, that has come and gone a little bit, but that's been the major change over the past year, that we've seen this threats number come up. We've also seen immigration come down a bit, 13%. That's the third place spot here. 13% say that immigration is their top issue. That is definitely less of a concern than it was in the lead up to the 2024 election. I think that probably does speak to some of the Trump administration's policies, but we really have seen that sort of evaporate as a top issue for folks.
Second term, and I think by this time the dust is settling a bit on his second term here and his policies. We are seeing the way that they're playing out. So when you look at this, how are voters feeling right now about the second term so far? Do they view it as more of a success or more of a failure?
Yeah, and sort of tracking along with his overall approval numbers, we see that the country is split. 50% say that this term has been more of a success versus 50% who say that it's more of a failure. Now, once again, younger folks are more likely to say that the second Trump administration is a failure, and independents, a majority say that it is more of a failure, 58%. That's a pretty big number. I would be a little concerned about that if I were a Republican looking at that, looking at the overall approval number and independents seemingly turning on Trump as well. That could be a concern heading into the midterms. But for now, we see that the country is very much split as it was heading into the 2024 election, 50-50 success versus failure.
I want to now turn to some international news. Recently, President Trump brokered a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, and the first phase was underway. We saw all living hostages released from Gaza. In exchange, we saw hundreds of Palestinian prisoners and detainees released back into Gaza. President Trump received a lot of credit for this ceasefire deal and negotiations. He declared the war is over. The Jerusalem Post had a photo of him on the front page saying, "God bless the peacemaker." Time magazine had a photo of President Trump on the cover saying his triumph. And Israelis really cheered when he visited the Middle East earlier this week. But what about the U.S. voter? How do they feel about how President handled these negotiations as well as ultimately the deal?
And so we talked about some of the lowlights, so to speak, of Trump's policy agenda, the economy. This is where he really has a highlight. And we see that a plurality approve of his handling of the Israel-Gaza war. 47% approve, 34% disapprove. So again, this is a really major highlight. We can see, why he does maintain 45% approval. That it's that high, considering that the economy is such a low issue for him. So again, big highlight here. By far his best issue. It was 30% approve, 46% disapprove in April. So it's a major improvement since earlier in the year. This shift largely comes from independents. They're now 43% approve, 38% disapprove. Although I do think it's worth noting here that foreign policy overall is just less of a priority for folks. It tracks much further down on issues. They're far more concerned about domestic policy like the economy. But, I think a win is a win here. This is obviously a great issue for Trump. He's really struck a chord here.
And maybe a bit of a less of a win for President Trump would be another international conflict, the Russia-Ukraine war. We haven't seen much movement in terms of getting to a ceasefire deal there. President Trump earlier this year, he met with Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, as well as Ukraine's President Zelensky. He's meeting with both of them again separately. How do voters in America, though, feel that he's handled this conflict?
Yeah, it's less rosy here. So Trump's handling of the Ukraine and Russia war, we see 30% approve, 50% disapprove. So that's a minus 20 net approval. That is a very slight improvement since April of about 5 points towards approval. But this is not a great issue for him. We've seen this in the past. We've seen this throughout his presidency. Folks really don't like how he has handled the Russia-Ukraine war, and we even see a little bit of defection from Republicans in this instance. We've seen that before. We see it now. Right around 20% of Republicans disapproving. And when we look at the favorabilities of Zelensky and Putin, we get a few clues maybe as to why. So 43% have a favorable opinion of President Zelensky versus 6% for Putin. So 74% have an unfavorable opinion of Vladimir Putin. I think that speaks a lot to how the electorate feels about this, and we can maybe see some hint of why President Trump has such a low approval rating on this war.
Matt, as we have this conversation, we are in over week 2 of the government shutdown with no end in sight, really. And overwhelmingly, in past polls, Americans do not like a government shutdown. There's blame to Democrats, blame to Republicans. I was actually at an event last week with no talk of politics. No one who was at this event worked in politics or the media. And a few people here did not even know the government was shut down. So I think that lends myself to my next question here. Are Americans feeling the impact of this shutdown yet?
Yeah, Brittany, that's fair, because the answer to that is really no. So 49% say that they've had no impact from the government shutdown. Another 30% say they've had some sort of minor impact on their daily lives. And then 14%, that's a fairly low number, say that the shutdown has had a major impact on their daily lives. Again, here we see that younger voters, for some reason, say that they're more likely to have had a major impact. I wasn't really expecting that. I would have expected maybe older voters, even who have to deal with Social Security and the like, that they would feel more of an impact, but we're not seeing that here. So that was a little bit of a surprise. But I do think that the overall perception here is that the federal government shutdown has not had a major effect on Americans' daily lives, at least not yet.
Well, a lot remains to be seen there because, as I said, it doesn't really seem like there's an end in sight. And we'll see when people start to feel that impact, which apparently some people are saying, hey, by the time it hits Thanksgiving, there will be an impact with travel. But we haven't hit Halloween yet, but hopefully it wraps up before then. But I do want to look to the future even further. Let's look at 2026. When you're looking at the midterms right now, who's in a better position, Democrats or Republicans?
So this is interesting, Brittany. We see that Trump overall has disapproval by about 3 points. We see that he's disapproved of in several policy categories apart from Israel, Gaza. We do not see that translating to Democrats benefiting on the generic congressional ballot. So right now we have them at 44%, Republicans at 43%, and an additional 14% who are undecided. That's very little change since August. Independents are breaking for Democrats by 10 points. I think that is a plus in their category. I would love to see that as a Democrat, if I were a Democrat, rather. But there is this major disconnect between Trump's approval, issues approval, and then the Democrats' vote share. I would be very scared if I were a Democratic lawmaker in Congress right now running for re-election, or if I'm a challenger to a Republican seat. That's not the number that I want to see. I would really like to see that number at about 4, maybe 5% to see results like in, say, 2018 when there was a so-called blue wave. We just do not see evidence of that yet. I think that Dems have their work cut out for them. They really will have to get out there and especially hammer some of this economic messaging that right now Trump is losing on, that congressional Republicans could be losing on, but we just don't see translating to Democratic vote share.
That's really interesting because usually the party that's not in the White House has better success in the midterms. You're saying as of now, we sit here a little over a year out from the midterms, you don't expect, based on these numbers, to see a blue wave materialize November 2026?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of time to go. We could see things change significantly, but we're getting closer to the point where if I'm a Democrat and I'm looking at that generic ballot number, I really need to see it at least 3% as folks start to make up their minds. So we do have a pretty high undecided factor here of 14%. So meaning votes are on the table there, but you've got to look and wonder why this overall disapproval of the administration is not translating to votes for Democrats. I think there needs to be some introspection there. And again, there's a lot of time. They can change their messaging, they can reach voters that they need to, but this shutdown is not having a major effect. Maybe it will at some point. And clearly folks are just not seeing what they want to see out of Democrats in order to vote for them on the congressional ballot. So that 1 point lead, that's effectively a tie. I would not want to see that if I'm a Democrat heading into the midterm elections. And once we get closer, say April of next year, May of next year, if that number isn't at 4% or 5%, then this could be a disaster for Democrats.
Well, I want to look even further at 2028, at the presidential election then. Back in August, California Governor Gavin Newsom was the front runner for the Democrats. And really, since the summer, Vice President J.D. Vance has been far and away in the lead for the GOP side. Head to head, what does that race look like now?
And that race looks pretty similar to what it did in August. So Newsom right now with 45%, Vance with 46%, effectively a tie here with 10% undecided. Again, we do see independents are breaking for the Democrat Newsom here, only by about 5 points though. So there's certainly votes on the table there. You know, we are obviously, we've got a lot of time ahead of us here. Anything could change, but right now it's a very competitive race. We look at the favorabilities and we see that Vance is overall much more favored than Newsom, 43% favorable versus 44% unfavorable. You look at Newsom and it's 34% favorable, 45% unfavorable. Again, I think all of these numbers could change within the next 2 to 3 years. We'll have to see what happens. But right now, if it were these two candidates, then we'd have a very competitive race on our hands.
And I have to ask you at the end here to read the tea leaves for us. When you're looking at these numbers for 2026 and 2028, what do they indicate to you? Does it matter more about the person at the top of the ticket or the person who's running? Or do you think it's really going to come down to issues?
I think the person will matter a lot, frankly. You know, we've seen that in the past several presidential elections, certainly, that personality matters a lot. But also messaging. We see that the economy is such a top issue for folks. There's obviously some disconnects between policy and how people feel. And I think that the candidates are going to have to speak to that, but you're going to have a messenger who's credible and who can resonate with folks in the way that some of these past candidates have, frankly, in the way that Donald Trump has with a lot of folks around the country. And we just have not seen that from many other candidates. So I think, you know, we look at Gavin Newsom, he is definitely trying to do that. He's getting more into this social media dynamic and putting himself out there. I think other Democrats are going to be doing the same thing. And I think it's smart for them to. I think that they do need to find a way to connect with voters, find a way to become relatable, because again, we just don't see those numbers translating to Democratic votes on the ballot thus far.
Well, I always love talking about 2026 and 2028, but I mean, they are what seems like light years away, and I'm sure so much can change between now and then. And I hope that means we can have many conversations ahead of us. Matt Taglia, thank you so much for joining me. I always appreciate the conversation.
So do I. Thanks so much, Brittany.